get a little crazy. For one thing, I become more daring. And like the Nagual showed us, a crack opens in front of us during those days. You're not a woman, so it can't make any sense to you, but 2 days before her period, a woman can open that crack and step through it into another world. With her left hand, she followed the contour of an invisible line that seemed to run vertically in front of her at arm's length. During that time, a woman, if she wants to, can let go of the images of the world, La Gorda went on. That's the crack between the worlds. And as the Nagual said, it is right in front of all of us women. The reason the Nagual believes women are better sorcerers than men is because they always have the crack in front of them, while a man has to make it. Well, it was during my periods that I learned in dreaming to fly with the lines of the world. I learned to make sparks with my body to entice the lines, and then I learned to grab them. And that's all I have learned in dreaming so far. I laughed and told her that I had nothing to show for my years of dreaming. You've learned how to call the allies in dreaming, she said with great assurance. I told her that Don Juan had taught me to make those sounds. She didn't seem to believe me. The allies must come to you, then, because they're seeking his luminosity, she said. The luminosity he left with you. He told me that every sorcerer has only so much luminosity to give away, so he parcels it out to all his children in accordance with an order that comes to him from somewhere out there in that vastness. In your case, he even gave you his own call. She clicked her tongue and winked at me. If you don't believe me, she went on, why don't you make the sound the Nagual taught you and see if the allies come to you? I felt reluctant to do it, not because I believed that my sound would bring anything, but because I didn't want to humor her. She waited for a moment, and when she was sure I wasn't going to try, she put her hand to her mouth and imitated my tapping sound to perfection. She played it for 5 or 6 minutes, stopping only to breathe. See what I mean? She asked, smiling. The allies don't give a fig about my calling, no matter how close it is to yours. Now, try it yourself. I tried. After a few seconds, I heard the call being answered. La Gorda jumped to her feet. I had the clear impression that she was more surprised than I was. She hurriedly made me stop, turned off the lantern, and gathered up my notes. She was about to open the front door, but she stopped short. A most frightening sound came from just outside the door. It sounded to me like a growl. It was so horrendous and ominous that it made us both jump back, away from the door. My physical alarm was so intense that I would have fled if I had had a place to go. Something heavy was leaning against the door. It made the door creak. I looked at La Gorda. She seemed to be even more alarmed. She was still standing with her arm outstretched as if to open the door. Her mouth was open. She seemed to have been frozen in mid-action. The door was about to be sprung open any moment. There were no bangs on it, just a terrifying pressure. Not only on the door, but all around the house. La Gorda stood up and told me to embrace her quickly from behind, locking my hands around her waist over her belly button. She performed then a strange movement with her hands. It was as though she were flipping a towel while holding it at the level of her eyes. She did it 4 times. Then she made another strange movement. She placed her hands at the middle of her chest with the palms up, one above the other, without touching. Her elbows were straight out to her sides. She clasped her hands as if she had suddenly grabbed 2 unseen bars. She slowly turned her hands over until the palms were facing down, and then she made a most beautiful, exertive movement, a movement that seemed to engage every muscle in her body. It was as though she were opening a heavy sliding door that offered a great resistance. Her body shivered with the exertion. Her arms moved slowly as if opening a very, very heavy door until they were fully extended laterally. I had the clear impression that as soon as she opened that door, a wind rushed through. That wind pulled us, and we actually went through the wall. Or rather, the walls of the house went through us. Or perhaps all three, La Gorda, the house, and myself, went through the door she had opened. All of a sudden, I was out in an open field. I could see the dark shapes of the surrounding mountains and trees. I was no longer holding on to La Gorda's waist. A noise above me made me look up, and I saw her hovering, perhaps 10 feet above me, like the black shape of a giant kite. I felt a terrible itch in my belly button, and then La Gorda plummeted down to the ground at top speed. But instead of crashing, she came to a soft, total halt. At the moment that La Gorda landed, the itch in my umbilical region turned into a horribly exhausting, nervous pain. It was as if her landing were pulling my insides out. I screamed in pain at the top of my voice. Then La Gorda was standing next to me, desperately out of breath. I was sitting down. We were again in the room of Don Genaro's house, where we had been. La Gorda seemed unable to catch her breath. She was drenched in perspiration. "We've got to get out of here," she muttered. It was a short drive to the little sister's house. None of them was around. La Gorda lit a lantern and led me directly to the open-air kitchen in the back. There she undressed herself and asked me to bathe her like a horse by throwing water on her body. I took a small tub full of water and proceeded to pour it gently on her, but she wanted me to drench her. She explained that a contact with the Allies, like the one we had, produced a most injurious perspiration that had to be washed off immediately. She made me take off my clothes and then drenched me in ice-cold water. Then she handed me a clean piece of cloth, and we dried ourselves as we walked back into the house. She sat on the big bed in the front room after hanging the lantern on the wall above it. Her knees were up, and I could see every part of her body. I hugged her naked body, and it was then that I realized what Doña Soledad had meant when she said that La Gorda was the Nagual's woman. She was formless, like Don Juan. I could not possibly think of her as a woman. I started to put on my clothes. She took them away from me. She said that before I could wear them again, I had to sun them. She gave me a blanket to put over my shoulders and got another one for herself. "That attack of the Allies was truly scary," she said as we sat down on the bed. "We were really lucky that we could get out of their grip. I had no idea why the Nagual told me to go to Genaro's with you. Now I know. That house is where the Allies are the strongest. They missed us by the skin of our teeth. We were lucky that I knew how to get out." "How did you do it, Gorda?" "I really don't know," she said. "I simply did it. My body knew how, I suppose, but when I want to think how I did it, I can't. This was a great test for both of us. Until tonight, I didn't know that I could open the eye. But look what I did. I actually opened the eye, just as the Nagual said I could. I've never been able to do it until you came along. I've tried, but it never worked. This time, the fear of those Allies made me just grab the eye the way the Nagual told me to, by shaking it 4 times in its 4 directions. He said that I should shake it as I shake a bedsheet, and then I should open it as a door by holding it right at the middle. The rest was very easy. Once the door was opened, I felt a strong wind pulling me instead of blowing me away. The trouble, the Nagual said, is to return. You have to be very strong to do that. The Nagual and Genaro and Eligio could go in and out of that eye like nothing. For them, the eye wasn't even an eye. They said it was an orange light like the sun. And so were the Nagual and Genaro, an orange light when they flew. I'm still very low on the scale. The Nagual said that when I do my flying, I spread out and look like a pile of cow dung in the sky. I have no light. That's why the return is so dreadful for me. Tonight, you helped me. and pulled me back, twice. The reason I showed you my flying tonight was because the Nagual gave me orders to let you see it, no matter how difficult or crummy it is. With my flying, I was supposed to be helping you, the same way you were supposed to be helping me when you showed me your double. I saw your whole maneuver from the door. You were so busy feeling sorry for Josefina that your body didn't notice my presence. I saw how your double came out from the top of your head. It wriggled out like a worm. I saw a shiver that began in your feet and went through your body, and then your double came out. It was like you, but very shiny. It was like the Nagual himself. That's why the sisters were petrified. I knew they thought that it was the Nagual himself, but I couldn't see all of it. I missed the sound because I have no attention for it. I beg your pardon? The double needs a tremendous amount of attention. The Nagual gave that attention to you, but not to me. He told me that he had run out of time. She said something else about a certain kind of attention, but I was very tired. I fell asleep so suddenly that I didn't even have time to put my notes away. Chapter 4. The Genaros. I woke up around 8 the next morning and found that La Gorda had sunned my clothes and made breakfast. We ate in the kitchen in the dining area. When we had finished, I asked her about Lydia, Rosa, and Josefina. They seemed to have vanished from the house. They're helping Soledad, she said. She's getting ready to leave. Where is she going? Somewhere away from here. She has no more reason to stay. She was waiting for you, and you have already come. Are the little sisters going with her? No. They just don't want to be here today. It looks as if today is not a good day for them to stick around. Why isn't it a good day? The Genaros are coming to see you today, and the girls don't get along with them. If all of them are here together, they'll get into a most dreadful fight. The last time that happened, they nearly killed one another. Do they fight physically? You bet they do. All of them are very strong, and none of them wants to take second place. The Nagual told me that that would happen, but I am powerless to stop them, and not only that, but I have to take sides, so it's a mess. How do you know that the Genaros are coming today? I haven't talked to them. I just know that they will be here today, that's all. Do you know that because you see Gorda? That's right. I see them coming. And one of them is coming directly to you because you're pulling him. I assured her that I wasn't pulling anyone in particular. I said that I hadn't revealed to anyone the purpose of my trip, but that it had to do with something I had to ask Pablito and Nestor. She smiled coyly and said that fate had paired me with Pablito, that we were very alike, and that undoubtedly he was going to see me first. She added that everything that happened to a warrior could be interpreted as an omen. Thus, my encounter with Soledad was an omen of what I was going to find out on my visit. I asked her to explain her point. The men will give you very little this time, she said. It's the women who will rip you to shreds, as Soledad did. That's what I would say, if I read the omen. You're waiting for the Genaros, but they are men like you. And look at this other omen. They are a little bit behind. I would say a couple of days behind. That's your fate as well as theirs, as men, to be always a couple of days behind. Behind what, Gorda? Behind everything. Behind us women, for instance. She laughed and patted my head. No matter how stubborn you are, she went on, you have to admit that I'm right. Wait and see. Did the Nagual tell you that men are behind women? I asked. Sure he did, she replied. All you have to do is look around. I do, Gorda, but I don't see any such thing. Women are always behind. They are dependent on men. She laughed. Her laughter wasn't scornful or bitter. It was rather a clear sound of joyfulness. You know the world of people better than I do, she said forcefully. But right now, I'm formless, and you're not. I'm telling you, women are better sorcerers because there is a crack in front of our eyes, and there is none in front of yours. She didn't seem angry, but I felt obliged to explain that I asked questions and made comments not because I was attacking or defending any given point, but because I wanted her to talk. She said that she had done nothing else but talk since the moment we met, and that the Nagual had trained her to talk because her task was the same as mine, to be in the world of people. Everything we say, she went on, is a reflection of the world of people. You will find out before your visit is over that you talk and act the way you do because you're clinging to the human form, just as the Genaros and the Little Sisters are clinging to the human form when they fight to kill one another. But aren't all of you supposed to cooperate with Pablito, Nestor, and Benigno? Genaro and the Nagual told every one of us that we should live in harmony and help and protect one another because we are alone in the world. Pablito was left in charge of us four, but he's a coward. If it were left up to him, he would let us die like dogs. When the Nagual was around, though, Pablito was very nice to us and took very good care of us. Everyone used to tease him and joke that he took care of us as if we were his wives. The Nagual and Genaro told him not too long before they left that he had a real chance to become the Nagual someday because we might become his four winds, his four corners. Pablito understood it to be his task, and from that day on, he changed. He became insufferable. He began to order us around as if we were really his wives. I asked the Nagual about Pablito's chances, and he told me that I should know that everything in a warrior's world depends on personal power, and personal power depends on impeccability. If Pablito were impeccable, he would have a chance. I laughed when he told me that. I know Pablito very well, but the Nagual explained to me that I shouldn't take it so lightly. He said that warriors always have a chance, no matter how slim. He made me see that I was a warrior myself and that I shouldn't hinder Pablito with my thoughts. He said that I should turn them off and let Pablito be, that the impeccable thing for me to do was to help Pablito, in spite of what I knew about him. I understood what the Nagual said. Besides, I have my own debt with Pablito, and I welcomed the opportunity to help him. But I also knew that no matter how I helped him, he was going to fail. I knew all along that he didn't have what it takes to be like the Nagual. Pablito is very childish, and he won't accept his defeat. He's miserable because he's not impeccable, and yet he's still trying in his thoughts to be like the Nagual. How did he fail? As soon as the Nagual left, Pablito had a deadly run-in with Lydia. Years ago, the Nagual had given him the task of being Lydia's husband, just for appearances. The people around here thought that she was his wife. Lydia didn't like that one bit. She's very tough. The truth of the matter is that Pablito has always been scared to death of her. They could never get along together, and they tolerated each other only because the Nagual was around. But when he left, Pablito got crazier than he already was and became convinced that he had enough personal power to take us as his wives. The three Genaros got together and discussed what Pablito should do and decided that he should take the toughest woman first, Lydia. They waited until she was alone, and then all three of them came into the house and grabbed her by the arms and threw her on the bed. Pablito got on top of her. She thought at first that the Genaros were joking, but when she realized that they were serious, she hit Pablito with her head in the middle of his forehead and nearly killed him. The Genaros fled, and Nestor had to tend to Pablito's wound for months. Is there something that I can do to help them understand? No. Unfortunately, understanding is not their problem. All six of them understand very well. The real trouble is something else, something very ugly that no one can help them with. They indulge in not trying to change. Since they know they won't succeed in changing, no matter how much they try, or want to, or need to, they've given up trying altogether. That's as wrong as feeling disappointed with our failures. The Nagual told each of them that warriors, both men and women, must be impeccable in their effort to change in order to scare the human form and shake it away. After years of impeccability, a moment will come, the Nagual said, when the form cannot stand it any longer and it leaves just as it left me. In doing so, of course, it injures the body and can even make it die, but an impeccable warrior survives, always. A sudden knock at the front door interrupted her. La Gorda stood up and went over to unlatch the door. It was Lydia. She greeted me very formally and asked La Gorda to go with her. They left together. I welcomed being alone. I worked on my notes for hours. The open-air dining area was cool and had very good light. La Gorda returned around noon. She asked me if I wanted to eat. I wasn't hungry, but she insisted that I eat. She said that contacts with the Allies were very debilitating and that she felt very weak herself. After eating, I sat down with La Gorda and was getting ready to ask her about dreaming when the front door opened loudly and Pablito walked in. He was panting. He obviously had been running and appeared to be in a state of great excitation. He stood at the door for a moment, catching his breath. He hadn't changed much. He seemed a bit older, or heavier, or perhaps only more muscular. He was, however, still very lean and wiry. His complexion was pale, as if he hadn't been in the sun for a long time. The brownness of his eyes was accentuated by a faint mark of weariness in his face. I remembered Pablito as having a beguiling smile. As he stood there looking at me, his smile was as charming as ever. He ran over to where I was sitting and grasped my forearms for a moment without saying a word. I stood up. He then shook me gently and embraced me. I myself was utterly delighted to see him. I was jumping up and down with an infantile joy. I didn't know what to say to him. He finally broke the silence. Maestro, he said softly, nodding his head slightly as if he were bowing to me. The title of Maestro, or teacher, caught me by surprise. I turned around, as if I were looking for someone else who was just behind me. I deliberately exaggerated my movements to let him know that I was mystified. He smiled, and the only thing that occurred to me was to ask him how he knew I was there. He said that he, Nestor, and Benigno had been forced to return because of a most unusual apprehension, which made them run day and night without any pause. Nestor had gone to their own house to find out if there was something there that would account for the feeling that had driven them. Benigno had gone to Soledad's place, and he himself had come to the girls' house. You hit the jackpot, Pablito, La Gorda said, and laughed. Pablito didn't answer. He glared at her. I bet that you're working yourself up to throw me out, he said in a tone of great anger. Don't fight with me, Pablito, La Gorda said, unruffled. Pablito turned to me and apologized, and then added in a very loud voice, as if he wanted someone else in the house to hear him, that he had brought his own chair to sit on, and that he could put it wherever he pleased. There's no one else around here except us, La Gorda said softly, and chuckled. I'll bring in my chair anyway, Pablito said. You don't mind, Maestro, do you? I looked at La Gorda. She gave me an almost imperceptible go-ahead sign with the tip of her foot. Bring it in. Bring anything you want, I said. Pablito stepped out of the house. They're all that way, La Gorda said. All three of them. Pablito came back a moment later carrying an unusual-looking chair on his shoulders. The chair was shaped to follow the contour of his back, so when he had it on his shoulders upside down, it looked like a backpack. "May I put it down?" he asked me. "Of course," I replied, moving the bench over to make room. He laughed with exaggerated ease. "Aren't you the Nagual?" he asked me, and then looked at La Gorda and added, "Or do you have to wait for orders?" "I am the Nagual," I said facetiously in order to humor him. I sensed that he was about to pick a fight with La Gorda. She must have sensed it too, for she excused herself and went out the back. Pablito put his chair down and slowly circled around me as if he were inspecting my body. Then he took his low back, narrow chair in one hand, turned it around, and sat down, resting his folded arms on the back of the chair that was made to allow him the maximum comfort as he sat astride it. I sat down facing him. His mood had changed completely the instant La Gorda left. "I must ask you to forgive me for acting the way I did," he said, smiling, "but I had to get rid of that witch." "Is she that bad, Pablito?" "You can bet on that," he replied. To change the subject, I told him that he looked very fine and prosperous. "You look very fine yourself, maestro," he said. "What's this nonsense of calling me maestro?" I asked in a joking tone. "Things are not the same as before," he replied. "We are in a new realm, and the witness says that you're a maestro now, and the witness cannot be wrong. But he will tell you the whole story himself. He'll be here shortly, and he'll be glad to see you again. I think that by now he must have felt that you're here. As we were coming back, all of us had the feeling that you might be on your way, but none of us felt that you had already arrived." I told him then that I had come for the sole purpose of seeing him and Nestor, that they were the only two people in the world with whom I could talk about our last meeting with Don Juan and Don Genaro, and that I needed, more than anything else, to clear up the uncertainties that last meeting had created in me. "We're bound to one another," he said. "I'll do anything I can to help, you know that. But I must warn you that I'm not as strong as you would want me to be. Perhaps it would be better if we didn't talk at all, but on the other hand, if we don't talk, we'll never understand anything." In a careful and deliberate manner, I formulated my query. I explained that there was one single issue at the crux of my rational predicament. "Tell me, Pablito," I said, "did we truly jump with our bodies into the abyss?" "I don't know," he said. "I really don't know." "But you were there with me. That's the point. Was I really there?" I felt annoyed at his cryptic replies. I had the sensation that if I would shake him or squeeze him, something in him would be set free. It was apparent to me that he was deliberately withholding something of great value. I protested that he would choose to be secretive with me when we had a bond of total trust. Pablito shook his head as if silently objecting to my accusation. I asked him to recount to me his whole experience, starting from the time prior to our jump when Don Juan and Don Genaro had prepared us together for the final onslaught. Pablito's account was muddled and inconsistent. All he could remember about the last moments before we jumped into the abyss was that after Don Juan and Don Genaro had said goodbye to both of us and had disappeared into the darkness, his strength waned. He was about to fall on his face, but I held him by his arm and carried him to the edge of the abyss, and there he blacked out. "What happened after you blacked out, Pablito?" "I don't know." "Did you have dreams or visions? What did you see?" "As far as I'm concerned, I had no visions, or if I did, I couldn't pay any attention to them. My lack of impeccability makes it impossible for me to remember them." "And then what happened?" "I woke up at Genaro's old place. I don't know how I got there." He remained quiet while I frantically searched in my mind for a question, a comment, a critical statement, or anything that would add extra breadth to his statements. As it was, nothing in Pablito's account was usable to buttress what had happened to me. I felt cheated. I was almost angry with him. My feelings were a mixture of pity for Pablito and myself, and at the same time a most intense disappointment. "I'm sorry I'm such a letdown to you," Pablito said. My immediate reaction to his words was to cover up my feelings and assure him that I wasn't disappointed at all. "I am a sorcerer," he said, laughing. "A poor one, but enough of a one to know what my body tells me, and right now it tells me that you're angry with me." "I'm not angry, Pablito," I exclaimed. "That's what your reason says, but not your body," he said. "Your body is angry. Your reason, however, finds no reason to feel anger toward me, so you're caught in a crossfire. The least I can do for you is to untangle this. Your body is angry because it knows that I'm not impeccable, and that only an impeccable warrior can help you. Your body is angry because it feels that I am wasting myself. It knew all that the minute I walked through that door." I didn't know what to say. I felt a flood of post-fact realizations. Perhaps he was right in saying that my body knew all that. At any rate, his directness in confronting me with my feelings had blunted the edge of my frustration. I began to wonder if Pablito was not just playing a game with me. I told him that being so direct and bold, he couldn't possibly be as weak as he pictured himself to be. "My weakness is that I'm made to have longings," he said, almost in a whisper. "I'm even to the point where I long for my life as an ordinary man. Can you believe that?" "You can't be serious, Pablito," I exclaimed. "I am," he replied. "I long for the grand privilege of walking the face of the earth as an ordinary man without this awesome burden." I found his stand simply preposterous and caught myself exclaiming over and over that he couldn't possibly be serious. Pablito looked at me and sighed. I was overtaken by a sudden apprehension. He seemed to be on the verge of tears. My apprehension gave way to an intense feeling of empathy. Neither of us could help each other. La Gorda came back to the kitchen at that moment. Pablito seemed to experience an instantaneous revitalization. He jumped to his feet and stomped on the floor. "What the hell do you want?" he yelled in a shrill, nervous voice. "Why are you snooping around?" La Gorda addressed me as if he didn't exist. She politely said that she was going to Soledad's house. "What the hell do we care where you go?" he yelled. "You can go to hell for that matter." He stomped on the floor like a spoiled child while La Gorda stood there, laughing. "Let's get out of this house, maestro," he said loudly. His sudden shift from sadness to anger fascinated me. I became engrossed in watching him. One of the features that I had always admired was his nimbleness. Even when he stomped his feet, his movements had grace. He suddenly reached across the table and nearly snatched my writing pad away from me. He grabbed it with the thumb and index finger of his left hand. I had to hold onto it with both hands, using all my strength. There was such an extraordinary force in his pull that if he had really wanted to take it, he could have easily jerked it away from my grip. He let go, and as he retrieved his hand, I saw a fleeting image of an extension to it. It happened so fast that I could have explained it as a visual distortion on my part, a product of the jolt of having to stand up halfway, drawn by the force of his pull, but I had learned by then that I could neither behave with those people in my accustomed manner, nor could I explain anything in my accustomed manner, so I didn't even try. "What's that in your hand, Pablito?" I asked. He recoiled in surprise and hid his hand behind his back. He had a blank expression and mumbled that he wanted us to leave that house because he was becoming dizzy. La Gorda began to laugh loudly and said that Pablito was as good a deceiver as Josefina, maybe even better, and that if I pressed him to tell me what was in his hand, he would faint, and Nestor would have to tend to him for months. Pablito began to choke. His face became almost purple. La Gorda told him in a nonchalant tone to cut out the acting because he had no audience. She was leaving, and I didn't have much patience. She then turned to me and told me in a most commanding tone to stay there and not to go to the Genaros's house. "Why in the hell not?" Pablito yelled and jumped in front of her as if trying to stop her from leaving. "What gall telling the maestro what to do?" "We had a bout with the allies in your house last night," La Gorda said to Pablito matter-of-factly. "The Nagual and I are still weak from that. If I were you, Pablito, I would put my attention to work. Things have changed. Everything has changed since he came." La Gorda left through the front door. I became aware then that, indeed, she looked very tired. Her shoes seemed too tight, or perhaps she was so weak that her feet dragged a little bit. She seemed small and frail. I thought that I must have looked as tired. Since there were no mirrors in the house, I had the urge to go outside and look at myself in the side mirror of my car. I perhaps would have done it, but Pablito thwarted me. He asked me in the most earnest tone not to believe a word of what she had said about his being a deceiver. I told him not to worry about that. "You don't like La Gorda at all, do you?" I asked. "You can say that again," he replied with a fierce look. "You know better than anyone alive the kind of monsters those women are. The Nagual told us that one day you were going to come here just to fall into their trap. He begged us to be on the alert and warn you about their designs. The Nagual said that you had 1 out of 4 chances. If our power was high, we could bring you here ourselves and warn you and save you. If our power was low, we ourselves would arrive here just in time to see your corpse. The 3rd chance was to find you either the slave to the witch Soledad or the slave of those disgusting mannish women. The 4th chance, and the faintest one of all, was to find you alive and well. The Nagual told us that in case you survived, you would then be the Nagual, and we should trust you because only you could help us." "I'll do anything for you, Pablito. You know that." "Not just for me. I'm not alone. The Witness and Benigno are with me. We're together, and you have to help all of us." "Of course, Pablito. That goes without saying. People around here have never bothered us. Our problems are with those ugly mannish freaks. We don't know what to do with them. The Nagual gave us orders to stay around them no matter what. He gave me a personal task, but I failed at it. I was very happy before, you remember. Now I can't seem to manage my life anymore." "What happened, Pablito?" "Those witches drove me from my house. They took over and pushed me out like trash. I now live in Genaro's house with Nestor and Benigno. We even have to cook our own meals. The Nagual knew that this might happen and gave La Gorda the task of mediating between us and those 3 bitches. But La Gorda is still what the Nagual used to call her, 220 buttocks. That was her nickname for years and years because she tipped the scale at 220 pounds. Pablito chuckled at his recollection of La Gorda. "She was the fattest, smelliest slob you'd ever want to see," he went on. "Today she's half her real size, but she's still the same fat, slow woman up there in her head, and she can't do a thing for us. But you're here now, Maestro, and our worries are over. Now we are 4 against 4. I wanted to interject a comment, but he stopped me. "Let me finish what I have to say before that witch comes back to throw me out," he said as he nervously looked at the door. "I know that they have told you that the 5 of you are the same because you are the Nagual's children. That's a lie. You're also like us, the Genaros, because Genaro also helped to make your luminosity. You're one of us, too. See what I mean? So, don't you believe what they tell you. You also belong to us. The witches don't know that the Nagual told us everything. They think that they are the only ones who know. It took 2 Toltecs to make us. We are the children of both. Those witches... Wait, Pablito, I said, putting my hand over his mouth. He stood up, apparently frightened by my sudden movement. What do you mean that it took 2 Toltecs to make us? The Nagual told us that we are Toltecs. All of us are Toltecs. He said that a Toltec is the receiver and holder of mysteries. The Nagual and Genaro are Toltecs. They gave us their special luminosity and their mysteries. We received their mysteries and now we hold them. His usage of the word Toltec baffled me. I was familiar only with its anthropological meaning. In that context, it always refers to a culture of Nahuatl-speaking people in central and southern Mexico, which was already extinct at the time of the conquest. Why did he call us Toltecs? I asked, not knowing what else to say. Because that's what we are. Instead of saying that we are sorcerers or witches, he said that we are Toltecs. If that's the case, why do you call the Little Sisters witches? Oh, that's because I hate them. That has nothing to do with what we are. Did the Nagual tell that to everyone? Why, certainly, everyone knows. But he never told me that. Oh, that's because you're a very educated man and are always discussing stupid things. He laughed in a forced, high-pitched tone and patted me on the back. Did the Nagual by any chance tell you that the Toltecs were ancient people that lived in this part of Mexico? I asked. See, there you go. That's why he didn't tell you. The old crow probably didn't know that they were ancient people. He rocked in his chair as he laughed. His laughter was very pleasing and very contagious. We are Toltecs, Maestro, he said. Rest assured that we are. That's all I know, but you can ask the witness. He knows. I lost my interest a long time ago. He stood up and went over to the stove. I followed him. He examined a pot of food cooking on a low fire. He asked me if I knew who had made that food. I was pretty sure that La Gorda had made it, but I said that I didn't know. He sniffed it 4 or 5 times in short inhalations like a dog. Then he announced that his nose told him that La Gorda had cooked it. He asked me if I had had some, and when I said that I had finished eating just before he arrived, he took a bowl from a shelf and helped himself to an enormous portion. He recommended in very strong terms that I should eat food cooked only by La Gorda and that I should only use her bowl as he himself was doing. I told him that La Gorda and the Little Sisters had served me my food in a dark bowl that they kept on a shelf apart from the others. He said that that bowl belonged to the Nagual. We went back to the table. He ate very slowly and did not talk at all. His total absorption in eating made me realize that all of them did the same thing. They ate in complete silence. La Gorda is a great cook, he said as he finished his food. She used to feed me. That was ages ago, before she hated me, before she became a witch. I mean, a Toltec. He looked at me with a glint in his eye and winked. I felt obligated to comment that La Gorda didn't strike me as being capable of hating anyone. I asked him if he knew that she had lost her form. That's a lot of baloney, he exclaimed. He stared at me as if measuring my look of surprise and then hid his face under his arm and giggled like an embarrassed child. Well, she actually did do that, he added. She's just great. Why do you dislike her, then? I'm going to tell you something, Maestro, because I trust you. I don't dislike her at all. She's the very best. She's the Nagual's woman. I just act that way with her because I like her to pamper me. And she does. She never gets mad at me. I could do anything. Sometimes I get carried away and I get physical with her and I want to strike her. When that happens, she just jumps out of the way, like the Nagual used to do. The next minute, she doesn't even remember what I did. That's a true formless warrior for you. She does the same thing with everyone, but the rest of us are a sorry mess. We're truly bad. Those 3 witches hate us, and we hate them back. You are sorcerers, Pablito. Can't you stop all this bickering? Sure we can. But we don't want to. What do you expect us to do? Be like brothers and sisters? I didn't know what to say. They were the Nagual's women, he went on. And yet everybody expected me to take them. How in heaven's name am I going to do that? I tried with one of them, and instead of helping me, the bastardly witch nearly killed me. So now every one of those women is after my hide as if I had committed a crime. All I did was to follow the Nagual's instructions. He told me that I had to be intimate with each of them, one by one, until I could hold all of them at once. But I couldn't be intimate with even one. I wanted to ask him about his mother, Doña Soledad, but I couldn't figure out a way to bring her into the conversation at that point. We were quiet for a moment. Do you hate them for what they tried to do to you? He asked, all of a sudden. I saw my chance. No, not at all, I said. La Gorda explained to me their reasons. But Doña Soledad's attack was very scary. Do you see much of her? He didn't answer. He looked at the ceiling. I repeated my question. I noticed then that his eyes were filled with tears. His body shook, convulsed by quiet sobs. He said that once he had had a beautiful mother, whom no doubt I could still remember. Her name was Manuelita, a saintly woman who raised 2 children, working like a mule to support them. He felt the most profound veneration for that mother who had loved and reared him. But one horrible day, his fate was fulfilled, and he had the misfortune to meet Genaro and the Nagual. And between the 2 of them, they destroyed his life. In a very emotional tone, Pablito said that the 2 devils took his soul and his mother's soul. They killed his Manuelita and left behind that horrendous witch, Soledad. He peered at me, with eyes flooded with tears, and said that that hideous woman was not his mother. She could not possibly be his Manuelita. He sobbed uncontrollably. I didn't know what to say. His emotional outburst was so genuine and his contentions so truthful that I felt swayed by a tide of sentiment. Thinking as an average civilized man, I had to agree with him. It certainly looked as if it was a great misfortune for Pablito to have crossed the path of Don Juan and Don Genaro. I put my arm around his shoulders and almost wept myself. After a long silence, he stood up and went out to the back. I heard him blowing his nose and washing his face in a pail of water. When he returned, he was calmer. He was even smiling. Don't get me wrong, Maestro, he said. I don't blame anyone for what has happened to me. It was my fate. Genaro and the Nagual acted like the impeccable warriors they were. I'm just weak, that's all, and I have failed in my task. The Nagual said that my only chance to avoid the attack of that horrendous witch was to corral the 4 winds and make them into my 4 corners, but I failed. Those women were in cahoots with that witch Soledad and didn't want to help me. They wanted me dead. The Nagual also told me that if I failed, you wouldn't stand a chance yourself. He said that if she killed you, I had to flee and run for my life. He doubted that I could even get as far as the road. He said that with your power and with what the witch already knows, she would have been peerless. So when I felt I'd failed to corral the 4 winds, I considered myself dead. And of course I hated those women. But today, Maestro, you bring me new hope. I told him that his feelings for his mother had touched me very deeply. I was, in fact, appalled by all that had happened, but I doubted intensely that I had brought hope of any kind to him. You have, he exclaimed with great certainty. I've felt terrible all this time. To have your own mother coming after you with an axe is nothing anyone can feel happy about. But now she's out of the way, thanks to you and whatever you did. Those women hate me because they're convinced I'm a coward. They just can't get it through their thick heads that we're different. You and those 4 women are different than me and the witness and Benigno in one important way. All 5 of you were pretty much dead before the Nagual found you. He told us that once you had even tried to kill yourself. We were not that way. We were well and alive and happy. We are the opposite of you. You are desperate people. We are not. If Genaro hadn't come my way, I would be a happy carpenter today, or perhaps I would have died. It doesn't matter. I would have done what I could, and that would have been fine. His words plunged me into a curious mood. I had to admit that he was right in that those women and myself were indeed desperate people. If I had not met Don Juan, I would no doubt be dead. But I couldn't say, as Pablito had, that it would have been fine with me either way. Don Juan had brought life and vigor to my body and freedom to my spirit. Pablito's statements made me remember something Don Juan had told me once when we were talking about an old man, a friend of mine. Don Juan had said in very emphatic terms that the old man's life or death had no significance whatsoever. I felt a bit cross at what I thought to be redundance on Don Juan's part. I told him that it went without saying that the life and death of that old man had no significance, since nothing in the world could possibly have any significance except to each one of us personally. You said it, he exclaimed and laughed. That's exactly what I mean. That old man's life and death have no significance to him personally. He could have died in 1929 or in 1950, or he could live until 1995. It doesn't matter. Everything is stupidly the same to him. My life before I met Don Juan had been that way. Nothing had ever mattered to me. I used to act as if certain things affected me, but that was only a calculated ploy to appear as a sensitive man. Pablito spoke to me and disrupted my reflections. He wanted to know if he had hurt my feelings. I assured him that it was nothing. In order to start up the conversation again, I asked him where he had met Don Genaro. My fate was that my boss got ill, he said, and I had to go to the city market in his place to build a new section of clothing booths. I worked there for 2 months. While I was there, I met the daughter of the owner of one of the booths. We fell in love. I built her father's stand a little bigger than the others, so I could make love to her under the counter while her sister took care of the customers. One day, Genaro brought a sack of medicinal plants to a retailer across the aisle, and while they were talking, he noticed that the clothing stand was shaking. He looked carefully at the stand, but he only saw the sister sitting on a chair half asleep. The man told Genaro that every day the stand shook like that around that hour. The next day, Genaro brought the Nagual to watch the stand shaking, and sure enough, that day, it shook. They came back the next day, and it shook again. So they waited there until I came out. That day I made their acquaintance, and soon after Genaro told me that he was an herbalist and proposed to make me a potion that no woman could resist. I liked women, so I fell for it. He certainly made the potion for me, but it took him 10 years. In the meantime, I got to know him very well, and I grew to love him more than if he were my own brother. And now I miss him like hell. So you see, he tricked me. Sometimes I'm glad that he did. Most of the time, I resent it, though. Don Juan told me that sorcerers have to have an omen before they choose someone. Was there something of that sort with you, Pablito? Yes. Genaro said that he got curious watching the stand shaking, and then he saw that 2 people were making love under the counter. so he sat down to wait for the people to come out. He wanted to see who they were. After a while, the girl appeared in the stand, but he missed me. He thought it was very strange that he would miss me after being so determined to set eyes on me. The next day, he came back with the Nagual. He also saw that 2 people were making love, but when it was time to catch me, they both missed me. They came back again the next day. Genaro went around to the back of the stand while the Nagual stayed out in front. I bumped into Genaro while I was crawling out. I thought he hadn't seen me because I was still behind the piece of cloth that covered a small square opening I had made on the side wall. I began to bark to make him think there was a small dog under the drape. He growled and barked back at me and really made me believe that there was a huge, mad dog on the other side. I got so scared, I ran out the other way and crashed into the Nagual. If he would have been an ordinary man, I would have thrown him to the ground because I ran right into him. But instead, he lifted me up like a child. I was absolutely flabbergasted. For being such an old man, he was truly strong. I thought I could use a strong man like that to carry lumber for me. Besides, I didn't want to lose face with the people who had seen me running out from under the counter. I asked him if he would like to work for me. He said yes. That same day, he went to the shop and started to work as my assistant. He worked there every day for 2 months. I didn't have a chance with those 2 devils. The incongruous image of Don Juan working for Pablito was extremely humorous to me. Pablito began to imitate the way Don Juan carried lumber on his shoulders. I had to agree with La Gorda that Pablito was as good an actor as Josefina. Why did they go to all that trouble, Pablito? They had to trick me. You don't think that I would go with them just like that, do you? I've heard all my life about sorcerers and curers and witches and spirits, and I've never believed a word of it. Those who talked about things like that were just ignorant people. If Genaro had told me that he and his friend were sorcerers, I would have walked out on them. But they were too clever for me. Those 2 foxes were really sly. They were in no hurry. Genaro said that he would have waited for me if it took him 20 years. That's why the Nagual went to work for me. I asked him to, so it was really me who gave them the key. The Nagual was a diligent worker. I was a little bit of a rascal in those days, and I thought I was the one playing a trick on him. I believed the Nagual was just a stupid old Indian. So I told him that I was going to tell the boss that he was my grandpa. Otherwise, they wouldn't hire him. But I had to get a percentage of his salary. And the Nagual said that it was fine with him. He gave me something out of the few pesos he made each day. My boss was very impressed with my grandpa because he was such a hard worker, but the other guys made fun of him. As you know, he had the habit of cracking all his joints from time to time. In the shop, he cracked them every time he carried anything. People naturally thought that he was so old that when he carried something on his back, his whole body creaked. I was pretty miserable with the Nagual as my grandpa, but by then Genaro had already prevailed on my greedy side. He had told me that he was feeding the Nagual a special formula made out of plants, and that it made him strong as a bull. Every day, he used to bring a small bundle of mashed up green leaves and feed it to him. Genaro said that his friend was nothing without his concoction, and to prove it to me, he didn't give it to him for 2 days. Without the green stuff, the Nagual seemed to be just a plain, ordinary old man. Genaro told me that I could also use his concoction to make women love me. I got very interested in it, and he said that we could be partners if I would help him prepare his formula and give it to his friend. One day he showed me some American money and told me he had sold his first batch to an American. That hooked me, and I became his partner. My partner, Genaro, and I had great designs. He said that I should have my own shop because with the money that we were going to make with this formula, I could afford anything. I bought a shop, and my partner paid for it. So I went wild. I knew that my partner was for real, and I began to work making his green stuff. I had the strange conviction at that point that Don Genaro must have used psychotropic plants in making his concoction. I reasoned that he must have tricked Pablito into ingesting it in order to assure his compliance. "Did he give you power plants, Pablito?" I asked. "Sure," he replied. "He gave me his green stuff. I ate tons of it." He described and imitated how Don Juan would sit by the front door of Don Genaro's house in a state of profound lethargy and then spring to life as soon as his lips touched the concoction. Pablito said that in view of such a transformation, he was forced to try it himself. "What was in that formula?" I asked. "Green leaves," he replied. "Any green leaves he could get a hold of. That was the kind of devil Genaro was. He used to talk about his formula and make me laugh until I was high as a kite. God, I really loved those days." I laughed out of nervousness. Pablito shook his head from side to side and cleared his throat 2 or 3 times. He seemed to be struggling not to weep. "As I've already said, Maestro," he went on, "I was driven by greed. I secretly planned to dump my partner once I had learned how to make the green stuff myself. Genaro must have always known the designs I had in those days, and just before he left, he hugged me and told me that it was time to fulfill my wish. It was time to dump my partner, for I had already learned to make the green stuff." Pablito stood up. His eyes were filled with tears. "That son of a gun, Genaro," he said softly. "That rotten devil. I truly loved him. And if I weren't the coward I am, I would be making his green stuff today." I didn't want to write anymore. To dispel my sadness, I told Pablito that we should go look for Nestor. I was arranging my notebooks in order to leave when the front door was flung open with a loud bang. Pablito and I jumped up involuntarily and quickly turned to look. Nestor was standing at the door. I ran to him. We met in the middle of the front room. He sort of leaped on me and shook me by the shoulders. He looked taller and stronger than the last time I had seen him. His long, lean body had acquired an almost feline smoothness. Somehow, the person facing me, peering at me, was not the Nestor I had known. I remembered him as a very shy man who was embarrassed to smile because of crooked teeth, a man who was entrusted to Pablito for his care. The Nestor who was looking at me was a mixture of Don Juan and Don Genaro. He was wiry and agile like Don Genaro, but had the mesmeric command that Don Juan had. I wanted to indulge in being perplexed, but all I could do was laugh with him. He patted me on the back. He took off his hat. Only then did I realize that Pablito didn't have one. I also noticed that Nestor was much darker and more rugged. Next to him, Pablito looked almost frail. Both of them wore American Levi's, heavy jackets, and crepe-soled shoes. Nestor's presence in the house lightened up the oppressive mood instantly. I asked him to join us in the kitchen. "You came right in time," Pablito said to Nestor with an enormous smile as we sat down. "The maestro and I were weeping here, remembering the Toltec devils." "Were you really crying, maestro?" Nestor asked with a malicious grin on his face. "You bet he was," Pablito replied. A very soft cracking noise at the front door made Pablito and Nestor stop talking. If I had been by myself, I wouldn't have noticed or heard anything. Pablito and Nestor stood up. I did the same. We looked at the front door. It was being opened in a most careful manner. I thought that perhaps La Gorda had returned and was quietly opening the door so as not to disturb us. When the door was finally opened wide enough to allow one person to go through, Benigno came in, as if he were sneaking into a dark room. His eyes were shut, and he was walking on the tips of his toes. He reminded me of a kid sneaking into a movie theater through an unlocked exit door in order to see a matinee, not daring to make any noise and, at the same time, not capable of seeing a thing in the dark. Everybody was quietly looking at Benigno. He opened one eye just enough to peek out of it and orient himself, and then he tiptoed across the front room to the kitchen. He stood by the table for a moment with his eyes closed. Pablito and Nestor sat down and signaled me to do the same. Benigno then slid next to me on the bench. He gently shoved my shoulder with his head. It was a light tap in order for me to move over to make room for him on the bench. Then he sat down comfortably with his eyes still closed. He was dressed in Levi's like Pablito and Nestor. His face had filled out a bit since the last time I had seen him years before, and his hairline was different, but I couldn't tell how. He had a lighter complexion than I remembered. Very small teeth, full lips, high cheekbones, a small nose, and big ears. He had always seemed to me like a child whose features had not matured. Pablito and Nestor, who had interrupted what they were saying to watch Benigno's entrance, resumed talking as soon as he sat down, as though nothing had happened. "Sure, he was crying with me," Pablito said. "He's not a crybaby like you," Nestor said to Pablito. Then he turned to me and embraced me. "I'm so glad you're alive," he said. "We've just talked to La Gorda, and she said that you were the Nagual, but she didn't tell us how you survived. How did you survive, Maestro?" At that point, I had a strange choice. I could have followed my rational path, as I had always done, and said that I didn't have the vaguest idea, and I would have been truthful at that. Or I could have said that my double had extricated me from the grip of those two women. I was measuring in my mind the possible effect of each alternative when I was distracted by Benigno. He opened one eye a little bit and looked at me, and then giggled and buried his head in his arms. "Benigno, don't you want to talk to me?" I asked. He shook his head negatively. I felt self-conscious with him next to me and decided to ask what was the matter with him. "What's he doing?" I asked Nestor in a low voice. Nestor rubbed Benigno's head and shook him. Benigno opened his eyes and then closed them again. "He's that way, you know," Nestor said to me. "He's extremely shy. He'll open his eyes sooner or later. Don't pay any attention to him. If he gets bored, he'll go to sleep." Benigno shook his head affirmatively without opening his eyes. "Well, how did you get out?" Nestor insisted. "Don't you want to tell us?" Pablito asked. I deliberately said that my double had come out from the top of my head 3 times. I gave them an account of what had happened. They didn't seem in the least surprised and took my account as a matter of course. Pablito became delighted with his own speculations that Doña Soledad might not recover and might eventually die. He wanted to know if I had struck Lydia as well. Nestor made an imperative gesture for him to be quiet, and Pablito meekly stopped in the middle of a sentence. "I'm sorry, Maestro," Nestor said, "but that was not your double." "But everyone said that it was my double." "I know for a fact that you misunderstood La Gorda, because as Benigno and I were walking to Genaro's house, La Gorda overtook us on the road and told us that you and Pablito were here in this house. She called you the Nagual. Do you know why?" I laughed and said that I believed it was due to her notion that I had gotten most of the Nagual's luminosity. "One of us here is a fool," Benigno said in a booming voice without opening his eyes. The sound of his voice was so outlandish that I jumped away from him. His thoroughly unexpected statement, plus my reaction to it, made all of them laugh. Benigno opened one eye and looked at me for an instant and then buried his face in his arms. "Do you know why we call Juan Matus the Nagual?" Nestor asked me. I said that I had always thought that that was their nice way of calling Don Juan a sorcerer. Benigno laughed so loudly that the sound of his laughter drowned out everybody else's. He seemed to be enjoying himself immensely. He rested his hand on my shoulder as if it were a heavy object he could no longer support. The reason we called him the Nahual, Nestor went on, is because he was split in two. In other words, anytime he needed to, he could get into another track that we don't have ourselves. Something would come out of him, something that was not a double but a horrendous, menacing shape that looked like him but was twice his size. We call that shape the Nahual, and anybody who has it is, of course, the Nahual. The Nahual told us that all of us can have that shape coming out of our heads if